You'll regret cutting my rules today. Ah!
Try me. I control the flow.
I could hear her heels clicking against the polished pavement before I even saw her, Marla Hendricks, clipboard in hand, scanning the perfectly trimmed lawns as if they were crime scenes. "Mr. Holloway, this is unacceptable," she snapped, her tone sharp, eyes scanning my property like I'd committed some mortal offense. The enforcer in crimson was at it again, twisting rules into threats I never agreed to, pointing at the small decorative fountain that had been in my family for decades. "Your water feature violates Section 12B of the Neighborhood Aesthetic Code. Immediate removal is required." I looked past her, at the fountain where my late daughter used to toss pennies and make wishes. The clipboard queen was oblivious to its sentimental value, her tyranny wrapped in a perfectly tailored navy blazer. "You really think I'll remove it?" I asked calmly, my voice steady, even as anger started to bubble beneath the surface. The tyrant in heels raised a brow, smirk tugging at the corner of her lips, confident I would bend. "The HOA has full authority, Mr. Holloway. Compliance is not optional." I let the words hang in the air, then leaned slightly toward the enforcer in crimson and whispered so only she could hear. "I designed the original drainage system for this fountain. Every pipe, every valve, documented and approved. It's legally mine." The officer of rules froze for a fraction of a second, realization dawning in her eyes. That pause, that tiny flicker, was all I needed to know. The power had subtly shifted. If you've ever felt that surge of control when someone underestimates you, you know exactly how I felt, so hit the subscribe button right now. The board chair thought she was untouchable, her clipboard an extension of her authority. But she hadn't accounted for preparation, knowledge, and calm determination. This wasn't just a backyard dispute. It was a test of patience, strategy, and resilience. I had a plan, though she could not see it yet. And for the neighbors peeking curiously from behind hedges and windows, this would be a lesson in how to challenge power without losing composure. I straightened, letting my eyes meet hers squarely. "Marla Hendricks, I'm not here to argue about aesthetics. I'm here to remind you that rules are meant to protect the community, not your personal sense of control." Her expression flickered, the clipboard queen momentarily shaken, but she quickly masked it with that practiced glare of indignation. The tyrant in heels couldn't believe someone dared to speak to her without fear. The fountain gurgled softly, water reflecting the afternoon sun, the sound grounding me in what really mattered. This wasn't about rules. This was about memory, legacy, and respect for the life my family had built here. I had watched my daughter play by this fountain for years, and now the officer of rules wanted to erase it like it meant nothing. Every threat she threw, every meticulously worded violation, only strengthened my resolve. This was personal, yes, but also a fight for the dignity of every neighbor who had suffered under her narrow, controlling vision. I could see it, the faint hesitation behind the clipboard, the subtle doubt creeping into the board chair's stance. She had underestimated not just my knowledge of the rules, but my willingness to defend what was mine. The enforcer in crimson may have thought this was a simple compliance check, a demonstration of power. Instead, it had become a stage for strategy. My calm, measured defiance was a silent statement. I knew the law, I knew my rights, and I wasn't afraid to assert them. "Where are you watching from?" I called toward the windows and porches, breaking the tension for the spectators hidden behind trimmed hedges and drawn blinds. This confrontation wasn't just mine, it belonged to the community. Every neighbor who had silently suffered under the clipboard queen's whims now had a front row seat to someone standing up intelligently, courageously, and legally. Marla Hendricks lifted her clipboard as if to issue another threat, but I was already a step ahead, having memorized every clause, every loophole, every nuance of the CC&Rs. The officer of rules may have had authority on paper, but here, in this moment, knowledge and preparation outweighed mere titles. I smiled faintly, letting the sound of gurgling water, the click of her heels, and the quiet hum of a gathering neighborhood all set the stage. This was just the beginning. The tension lingered in the air long after Marla Hendricks's heels had retreated to the paved walkway, the click of her departure echoing like a challenge I hadn't yet accepted. The clipboard queen had left her mark, leaving behind a meticulously worded violation notice that smelled of control and condescension. I watched the paper flutter in the light breeze, thinking of all the neighbors who had endured similar micromanagement, silent and powerless. The enforcer in crimson had no idea that every minor overreach only fed the fire of unity slowly building across our street. From the corner of my porch, I observed Mrs. Langley's dog prance nervously near the garden gate. The tyrant in heels had threatened to enforce height limits, color schemes, and even the angle of a hedge. But now the officer of rules' actions would be scrutinized in ways she had never anticipated. I knew I couldn't confront her directly in public yet. She thrived on dramatics and would weaponize any misstep. The board chair believed intimidation and paperwork could maintain her empire of compliance, but my strategy relied on subtle observation and gathering proof that her actions overstepped legal and ethical boundaries. I walked slowly along the edge of my yard, fingers grazing the bricks of the fountain, the symbol of my family's history here. Marla Hendricks had no right to disregard the memories tied to these grounds, and yet she assumed her authority gave her omnipotence. The clipboard queen, confident in her supremacy, didn't account for quiet resilience or the strategic patience that came with knowing the rules better than anyone else. Each neighbor who had suffered under her arbitrary decrees now had a glimmer of hope, a chance to see someone stand calmly and intelligently against her tyranny. The next day, the officer of rules returned, but this time it was different. The enforcer in crimson approached with an aura of irritation. She had clearly been murmuring to herself about my unflappable stance. The tyrant in heels might have expected panic, but instead, I greeted her with a composed nod, letting her realize I was already anticipating her next move. Marla Hendricks had a habit of escalating, and I knew that each escalation would provide more ammunition for exposing her overreach to the community. Her confidence was the perfect camouflage for the chaos she caused, yet beneath it, cracks had begun to form. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, from their balconies, silently witnessing the chess match unfold. I had spent hours memorizing the HOA covenants, understanding which clauses she had twisted for personal power. Every subtle infraction, every overreaching directive would be documented and shared strategically. The board chair didn't know that my calm exterior masked a mind actively constructing a plan to unify the neighborhood and dismantle her unilateral control. The clipboard queen's arrogance had underestimated the quiet, observant presence of someone who respected both the law and community. The officer of rules tried to interject, waving the violation notice as if the paper itself carried authority beyond the scope of logic or legality. "Mr. Holloway, this will be enforced immediately," she snapped, her tone sharp yet slightly brittle, betraying the faint awareness that her strategy might not be as flawless as she imagined. The enforcer in crimson had misjudged me, believing my restraint was weakness, when in truth it was deliberate. A calculated decision to gather evidence while allowing her arrogance to do most of the work. The tyrant in heels had yet to realize that patience, knowledge, and procedural expertise would be the very tools to topple her perceived supremacy. I turned back toward my porch, letting the subtle sound of water from the fountain soothe my thoughts. Each neighbor who had observed the scene was now part of a growing consciousness, a silent acknowledgement that change was possible. Marla Hendricks's reign of fear relied on isolation, but I had begun knitting a network of understanding, connecting small injustices into a comprehensive narrative of misuse of power. The board chair's grip was not absolute, and her own rules would become the framework for her exposure. By the time the sun had begun its descent, the officer of rules had retreated once more, leaving behind the faint echo of threatened compliance. I could feel the anticipation building in the neighborhood, subtle but potent, like an approaching storm. The clipboard queen's next move would be critical, and I was ready, having already mapped every potential escalation and its counter. Each action she took, every arbitrary decree, would be another thread weaving the story of her overreach, threads I intended to unravel for all to see. The morning sun fell harshly on the manicured lawns, casting long shadows from the neatly trimmed hedges, as if nature itself was wary of Marla Hendricks's looming presence. The clipboard queen emerged from the HOA office, her steps measured, deliberate, each click of her heels against the pavement, announcing the arrival of authority. I could see the neighbors watching, their eyes betraying a mix of anxiety and quiet anticipation. The officer of rules had always thrived on being observed, performing for the audience. But this time, the enforcer in crimson would encounter a calm, prepared mind, ready to scrutinize every move. I had arranged my day meticulously, knowing that the tyrant in heels would attempt a morning inspection, as she often did to assert dominance before most homeowners were awake. The board chair, fully convinced of her control, did not anticipate that my focus was on patterns and vulnerabilities, not confrontation. From my porch, I watched her walk along the street, clipboard clutched tightly, her gaze scanning every mailbox, shrub, and driveway for any imperfection she could seize upon. Marla Hendricks's reputation for micromanagement was legendary, and yet her authority rested more on fear than legality, a fragile foundation built from intimidation and selective enforcement. Today I wasn't just observing, I was also listening. A neighbor, whom I had cautiously befriended, provided insider details about prior complaints, fines, and undocumented actions by the clipboard queen. The information painted a broader picture. The officer of rules had a history of leveraging the HOA guidelines for personal gain, often targeting those who challenged her subtly. Her arrogance as the enforcer in crimson made her predictable, patterns that I could anticipate, strategies I could counter. Even the tyrant in heels had blind spots, and I intended to exploit them with precision. Marla Hendricks paused briefly near the corner hydrant, pen hovering over her clipboard, the faintest flicker of doubt crossing her features before it disappeared behind practiced confidence. She did not notice me standing slightly hidden, camera and notebook in hand, documenting everything. The board chair's expression was a mixture of pride and control, unaware that each gesture, each casual remark, was being cataloged for future leverage. I felt the weight of responsibility, the conflicted witness to this power dynamic, understanding that the neighborhood's trust rested partially on my observation and integrity. By mid-morning, the officer of rules had approached the Jenkins property, scrutinizing a minor paint discrepancy that, under any fair assessment, was negligible. The enforcer in crimson seemed oblivious to the ripple effect of her actions, how each overreach sparked frustration and whispered conversations among homeowners. I could sense the undercurrent of solidarity building subtly, fueled by shared experiences and my quiet presence. Even the tyrant in heels could not suppress the growing awareness that her unilateral power was being challenged, recorded, and analyzed. At the far end of the cul-de-sac, I noticed the conflicted witness, a young board member caught between loyalty and conscience, hesitating near the edge of the street. The clipboard queen had overlooked them, yet their body language betrayed internal struggle. Tense shoulders, averted gaze, fingers fidgeting with a pen. They were aware of the officer of rules pattern of overreach and the potential consequences of being complicit. Marla Hendricks had underestimated the weight of subtle observation, the way quiet witnesses could tip the balance of power by simply providing truth at the right moment. The morning progressed with predictable rituals. Marla Hendricks and the enforcer in crimson checked driveways, mailboxes, and shrub heights, issuing minor warnings that often seemed disproportionate. Each action provided insight into her operating procedure, highlighting inconsistencies and arbitrary enforcement. The tyrant in heels had cultivated fear, but now, in this carefully mapped observation, I realized her methods were as rigid as they were flawed, leaving openings for strategy and counteraction. By noon, the conflicted witness approached cautiously, eyes darting toward the clipboard queen. Their hesitation was palpable, the moral weight of participating in or opposing Marla Hendricks's overreach pressing heavily. This small act of internal struggle, the visible tension, the questioning glance, would soon play a pivotal role. The officer of rules might have assumed control through intimidation, but awareness and courage were quietly coalescing into something more potent than fear. The board chair's reign depended on compliance, and today, that compliance had cracks, first glimpses of defiance ready to be leveraged. The afternoon sunlight gleamed off the polished brass numbers on each mailbox as Marla Hendricks, the clipboard queen, marched down the cul-de-sac with the precision of a general inspecting her troops. The officer of rules scanned every driveway and flower bed with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the minor infractions she sought. Yet, her focus revealed the enforcer in crimson's true obsession: control. From my vantage point behind a large oak tree, I could see the tyrant in heels in her element, oblivious to the fact that every gesture, every pointed finger, and every critical note was being cataloged, recorded, and analyzed. The board chair's arrogance made her predictable. It was almost too easy to anticipate the next move. The clipboard queen stopped at the Simmons corner lot, bending low to inspect the decorative edging around a bush, She scribbled furiously, muttering under her breath about non-compliant landscaping. The officer of rules had no idea that her insistence on perfection and her obsession with aesthetic dominance was creating the cracks that I could exploit. Each minor threat issued, each overreach documented, was a step toward the eventual unraveling of her authority. Marla Hendricks believed fear equaled control, yet the tide was shifting subtly, imperceptibly to her, but unmistakably to those watching and listening. I moved quietly across the street, my notepad filled with observations, each entry meticulously noting patterns of behavior and overreach. The enforcer in crimson had a rigid routine: approach a property, identify a perceived violation, issue a citation, and leave with a satisfied smirk. Her reliance on spectacle over legality created predictable openings. I noted the tyrant in heel's body language, the slight tightening of her jaw when confronted with minor resistance, the barely perceptible hesitation before asserting authority. These nuances were small, but for someone methodical like me, they were powerful tools waiting to be leveraged. At the corner of the cul-de-sac, a neighbor peeked from behind their gate, visibly uneasy yet curious. The clipboard queen had underestimated the community's attention, assuming her role as the officer of rules made her untouchable. Marla Hendricks thrived on compliance, but subtle defiance had begun to emerge, whispers among homeowners that questioned her unilateral decisions and excessive enforcement. The enforcer in crimson had created an ecosystem of fear, but fear is fragile when confronted with evidence and collective awareness. The tyrant in heels had yet to understand the slow, methodical counter that was already taking shape around her. The conflicted witness, still hesitant, lingered near the edge of the sidewalk. Their internal struggle was visible, hands gripping a clipboard tightly, shoulders tense, eyes darting between the board chair and myself. The young ally had seen the arbitrary enforcement, the fines without quorum, the personal biases interwoven into decisions. This hesitation was crucial, a sign that even the officer of rules could not maintain complete dominion. Marla Hendricks, in her obsession with authority, had inadvertently revealed the seeds of her vulnerability. Later, the enforcer in crimson approached my property, scrutinizing the newly installed garden fountain. She measured, circled, and jotted notes, labeling minor discrepancies as violations of HOA bylaws. The tyrant in heels did not realize that her aggressive inspection created opportunity. Neighbors observing, whispers spreading, questions forming. Each deliberate overstep added fuel to a slow-burning plan, and the clipboard queen's obsession with perceived perfection made her predictable, almost mechanical in her approach. By late afternoon, patterns were unmistakable. Marla Hendricks's movements, reactions, and enforcement methods had been cataloged thoroughly. The officer of rules was meticulous, yet inflexible, leaving gaps for strategic response. The conflicted witness finally shifted, stepping slightly closer to my side, their eyes betraying a willingness to act, to share crucial information that could tip the balance. The board chair had underestimated the quiet, meticulous preparation of someone who understood the rules, understood the neighborhood, and understood the weight of evidence. The enforcer in crimson's tyranny had created its own undoing, and the first pieces of that unraveling were falling into place. The following morning, the sun had barely breached the treetops when Marla Hendricks, the board chair in her trademark heels, appeared at the far end of the cul-de-sac, clipboard clutched like a shield. The enforcer in crimson moved with the calculated confidence of someone accustomed to obedience. But today there was a subtle shift in the neighborhood's energy, an undercurrent of defiance that she hadn't anticipated. The clipboard queen's eyes scanned every driveway, every hedge, and every mailbox, as if hunting for weaknesses, unaware that her own predictability was being studied, logged, and turned into a roadmap for the counter-strategy forming quietly around her. Across the street, I crouched behind a row of hydrangeas, notebook in hand, observing each movement. The officer of rules had a pattern: approach, intimidate, note, depart. Marla Hendricks paused at the Peterson residence, scrutinizing the uneven spacing of their new garden edging. Her face was the picture of satisfaction as she jotted notes about non-compliance, completely oblivious to the subtle signals of rebellion flickering through the windows. Even as she marked down the alleged violations, whispers from neighbors began to circulate, soft murmurs about arbitrary fines, selective enforcement, and the board chair's tendency to bend rules in her favor. The tyrant in heels thrived on secrecy and control, yet she had inadvertently made her influence visible and vulnerable. I moved slightly closer to the curb, catching the subtle reactions of the conflicted witness stationed near the empty lot. Their hands trembled as they adjusted the strap of their tote, eyes flicking between the enforcer in crimson and the small group of neighbors huddled nearby. Each hesitation, every subtle glance, was a sign of the internal struggle, loyalty to the HOA's authority clashing with a growing sense of injustice. Marla Hendricks was unknowingly providing the catalyst for action as the witness began mentally cataloging instances of favoritism, overreach, and breaches of procedure. Even the clipboard queen could not fully conceal the cracks in her facade. The officer of rules proceeded to the Davis property, stepping lightly over the freshly mulched flower beds, inspecting the height of their decorative fence with precision. She adjusted her clipboard as if the act itself imbued power, unaware that her meticulous attention to minute detail was being converted into leverage against her. Marla Hendricks had created an open ledger of her own biases. Each infraction she magnified, each rule she twisted, was being compiled silently, forming the blueprint for exposing her misconduct. The board chair's obsession with perfection and control became her blind spot, offering a clear path for the neighborhood to reclaim authority. Neighbors began to linger at a distance, peeking from behind curtains or across their front lawns, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet frustration. The tyrant in heels had not accounted for the ripple effect her constant scrutiny caused. Each minor violation cited, each excessive note scribbled, fed a growing sense of unity among those who had previously felt powerless. The clipboard queen had underestimated the slow, inevitable build of collective awareness. Marla Hendricks' own energy was catalyzing the very momentum that would challenge her reign. By midday, patterns were unmistakable. The officer of rules returned to the board's shared office, satisfied with her morning inspections, but unaware that her methodical approach had laid bare every arbitrary decision, every inconsistency, and every opportunity for procedural challenge. The conflicted witness, emboldened by proximity to the evidence and the unspoken support of neighbors, edged closer to decisive action. Even as Marla Hendricks plotted her next inspection, the seeds of disruption had been sown. The enforcer in crimson's own meticulousness, intended as a weapon of control, had become the mechanism by which her authority could be legally and socially undermined. The sun began to dip behind the rooftops, casting long shadows over the cul-de-sac. Marla Hendricks, the board chair, the clipboard queen, and the tyrant in heels retreated with her usual air of triumph, unaware that the neighborhood's tide was quietly turning. The officer of rules' rigid enforcement had inadvertently created the foundation for its own undoing, and the first real signs of coordinated resistance were beginning to emerge. The conflicted witness shifted slightly closer to me, a silent acknowledgement that the long, meticulous preparation was paying off. By late afternoon, the neighborhood had taken on a quiet tension, the kind that precedes inevitable change. Marla Hendricks, the clipboard queen, returned with renewed authority, striding down the familiar cul-de-sac, heels clicking on the pavement with precision that demanded attention. The enforcer in crimson had a checklist in hand, eyes scanning fences, flower beds, and driveways with exacting scrutiny. Yet this time, the subtle energy of defiance in the air was palpable. Neighbors peeked, cautiously from behind curtains and hedges, noticing the relentless gaze of the board chair, the officer of rules, and feeling an unfamiliar surge of solidarity. Each observed infraction fueling collective indignation. The tyrant in heels paused at the Ramirez property, arms folded tightly, assessing the alignment of their newly installed solar lights. Her pen hovered over the clipboard, ready to note a violation that had never been specified in any official guideline. Marla Hendricks had always thrived on minor, subjective criticisms, and this morning she had already reminded everyone of her reach. Yet, as she cataloged discrepancies with habitual precision, I could see how her obsessive focus was opening cracks. The meticulous officer of rules was unwittingly supplying the narrative, creating a paper trail of arbitrary enforcement that could be leveraged strategically. Across the street, I moved quietly among the neighbors who had gathered in small clusters, exchanging hushed observations. Each of us was cataloging instances where the clipboard queen overstepped her authority, fines issued without quorum approval, selective enforcement that targeted dissenters, and the enforcement of rules that had no basis in the official HOA bylaws. The board chair's insistence on perfection, on absolute control, had created an environment where procedural errors were visible to all who cared to look. Even the tyrant in Heel's subtle gestures, the twitch of her lips, and the rigid set of her shoulders became evidence of her rigidity and predictability. The conflicted witness lingered near the community mailbox, shifting nervously as if their loyalty to the board conflicted with a sense of fairness. Their eyes followed the enforcer in crimson as she circled the cul-de-sac, clipboard in hand, oblivious to the subtle but growing network of observation. Each jot of ink and each whispered critique created a mosaic of authority ripe for challenge. The officer of rules believed herself untouchable, unaware that her own actions were creating the framework for her eventual exposure. Marla Hendricks's relentless drive for control had set the stage for a meticulously calculated response. I ducked behind a row of hedges near the corner property, noting the strategic placement of security cameras, the angles of light, and the patterns of movement. Every approach by the clipboard queen, every step of the tyrant in heels was being analyzed, logged, and planned against. The enforcer in crimson had become an unwitting accomplice to the neighborhood's quiet revolution, providing the structure for an intricate response that adhered to every legal and procedural detail. The conflicted witness, still hesitant but leaning ever closer, began to see how small acts of courage could amplify collective power. As the sun started its descent, the board chair retraced her morning route, inspecting the alignment of mailboxes, the placement of garden gnomes, and the height of hedges. Each minor violation noted, each arbitrary judgment delivered, reinforced the neighborhood's awareness of her capricious authority. The clipboard queen's meticulous record-keeping, intended to intimidate, instead became the very tool by which procedural errors could be highlighted and challenged. The officer of rules moved with rigid precision, unaware that her own dedication to order was painting a clear picture of bias, favoritism, and overreach. By evening, shadows stretched long across the driveways, and the quiet murmurs of residents grew louder. Marla Hendricks, the tyrant in heels, remained unaware that each step she took had contributed to the blueprint for her undoing. The conflicted witness, emboldened by proximity to both the evidence and our growing coalition, edged ever closer to providing the critical insight that would turn meticulous observation into decisive action. The enforcer in Crimson's adherence to rules had unintentionally provided the tools to dismantle her reign, and the first tangible threads of a neighborhood counter-strategy were now fully visible. The morning air was thick with tension, the kind that makes the usual suburban calm feel brittle, ready to fracture. Marla Hendricks, the clipboard queen, arrived at the community center, her heels striking the pavement like the ticking of a metronome, punctuating the beginning of another day of scrutiny. The enforcer in crimson scanned the gathered neighbors, arms folded, pen poised over her familiar checklist. The officer of rules' presence alone was enough to draw polite nods and nervous glances, yet beneath the surface, the atmosphere was charged with quiet defiance. Today, however, a subtle shift had begun. The conflicted witness, a board member quietly observing from the side, carried information that could change the course of the confrontation entirely. The tyrant in heels moved deliberately down the center aisle of the room, clipboard in hand, cataloging minor infractions with her usual meticulous precision. Marla Hendricks had always relied on fear and authority to maintain order, yet the community's awareness of her overreach was growing, and each neighbor's discreet, watchful gaze became a subtle counterweight to her intimidation. The conflicted witness, shifting uneasily between fear and a sense of duty, finally took a step forward, their voice breaking slightly as they began to share critical insight about the board chair's manipulations. This moment marked the first tangible crack in the seemingly impenetrable facade of absolute control. I observed from the corner, noting the witness's hesitation, the careful weight of each word, and the trembling authority in their delivery. The enforcer in crimson seemed to notice the change, a flicker of uncertainty passing across her face. The clipboard queen, accustomed to compliance and silence, froze momentarily, sensing that the routine structure she had wielded as power was beginning to unravel. Every detailed note the tyrant in heels had made, every arbitrary enforcement action cataloged, now became evidence in the hands of those who understood the law and the community bylaws. The conflicted witness provided the precise instance where quorum rules had been bypassed, where favoritism had skewed enforcement, and where the board chair had violated the foundational agreements of governance. The room hummed with restrained murmurs as neighbors leaned in, each carefully listening to the witness's words. Marla Hendricks, who had commanded authority for years with absolute certainty, now faced a tangible challenge she had not anticipated. The officer of rules' posture remained rigid, yet her eyes betrayed the first hints of concern. The witness detailed the instances of selective enforcement, the misuse of power, and the procedural missteps that had long gone unnoticed. Every example reinforced the community's growing recognition that the clipboard queen's authority, though formidable, was neither unassailable nor justified. As the narrative unfolded, I moved quietly among the neighbors, subtly validating the witness's observations, nodding, and emphasizing the importance of what was being revealed. The tyrant in heels, confronted with evidence of her own procedural violations, began to exhibit signs of unease. Marla Hendricks's meticulous record-keeping, intended to intimidate and suppress dissent, had now become the foundation for accountability. Each misstep cataloged became a stepping stone for a larger strategy, one that could mobilize the community, expose overreach, and reclaim the neighborhood's trust in governance. By the time the meeting reached its midpoint, the conflicted witness had fully revealed the hidden dynamics of the board chair's manipulations, highlighting patterns of favoritism and selective enforcement that had undermined fairness for years. The clipboard queen, caught off guard by the level of detail and the collective attention, could only maintain a facade of control while internally scrambling to assess the threat. The officer of rules, the enforcer in crimson, and the tyrant in heels were all now confronted with the reality that their authority, built on fear and opacity, was vulnerable to methodical, evidence-based challenge. As the final remarks of the witness concluded, a palpable shift rippled through the room. Marla Hendricks's command over the narrative had begun to erode. The conflicted witness, though still hesitant, had provided the key insight that would allow a strategically minded protagonist to convert observation into decisive action. It was the beginning of a turning point, the moment when awareness and courage merged to challenge long-standing tyranny. The stage was now set for meticulous planning, community coordination, and the eventual execution of a carefully crafted strategy that would hold the board accountable and restore balance to the neighborhood. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Willow Creek, illuminating the subtle tension in every corner of the neighborhood. Marla Hendricks, the board chair, arrived with her signature brisk pace, clipboard clutched tightly as though it were a shield. The enforcer in crimson scanned the streets with a critical eye, noting every car parked slightly askew, every shrub growing beyond the acceptable height. Even the clipboard queen's measured steps carried an air of command that made onlookers instinctively straighten their posture. Yet, beneath her polished authority, a quiet unease lingered. Neighbors were no longer merely observing, they were questioning, and the conflicted witness had revealed enough cracks to seed doubt in previously unquestioned power. I followed the proceedings carefully, calculating each move, listening to the hushed exchanges among the residents. The tyrant in heels had issued a new series of letters earlier in the morning, each one citing vague violations and threatening fines. Every paper carried Marla Hendricks's unmistakable signature, a mark of the clipboard queen's unyielding will. But now, with community awareness growing, each letter seemed less like a mandate and more like a provocation, a misstep waiting to be leveraged. The officer of rules, usually confident in her ability to suppress dissent, now hovered at the periphery, uncertain of how to respond, as the wind of change began rustling the leaves of complacency. The conflicted witness stepped forward again, offering insight into past infractions and procedural missteps that Marla Hendricks had assumed would remain hidden. They detailed how the enforcer in crimson had selectively enforced rules, how fines were levied without proper quorum, and how favoritism had influenced decisions regarding neighborhood improvements. Each revelation was met with subtle gasps and nods among the residents, their expressions a mixture of shock, validation, and the stirrings of determination. Marla Hendricks, sensing the shift, tightened her grip on her clipboard, the paper trembling slightly in her hand, betraying her normally unflappable composure. I began coordinating discreetly with key neighbors, signaling that a strategic response was now possible. The clipboard queen's overreach, once a tool of intimidation, was now exposed as inconsistent and legally questionable. Every misstep cataloged by the conflicted witness became ammunition in the unfolding battle for accountability. I considered the logistics, how to organize the community, gather additional evidence, and present a unified front. Each element had to be precise. The enforcer in crimson was vigilant, and any sign of unpreparedness could be exploited to derail the effort. As the afternoon progressed, Marla Hendricks continued her rounds, inspecting driveways, garden beds, and fences, with the meticulous scrutiny of the tyrant in heels. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances, their confidence quietly bolstered by the witness's revelations. The officer of rules posture, once authoritative, now showed subtle signs of hesitation. The balance of power was shifting incrementally. The enforcer in crimson had underestimated the combination of strategic patience, legal insight, and communal solidarity. I observed every detail, the whispered conversations, the pointed stares, the way the clipboard queen's orders were now quietly questioned. The conflicted witness provided not only facts, but the subtle guidance that allowed me to anticipate Marla Hendricks's next moves. It was a dance of strategy and perception, where each carefully measured step advanced our eventual plan to expose overreach and reclaim community autonomy. The stage was being meticulously set for a decisive maneuver that would catch the tyrant in heels off guard. By the late afternoon, a plan had crystallized in my mind, a community action, orchestrated with precision, leveraging the procedural vulnerabilities revealed by the conflicted witness. Marla Hendricks remained unaware of the scope of coordination quietly unfolding around her, each neighbor now a potential ally in the forthcoming effort. The enforcer in crimson, the board chair, the clipboard queen, all were being drawn unwittingly into a situation where their overconfidence would become their undoing. The momentum had shifted, and the careful orchestration of strategy and timing promised that the next confrontation would decisively favor those who had waited, observed, and planned. The following morning, a thin fog clung to the streets of Willow Creek, creating a muted, almost cinematic backdrop for the day's brewing conflict. Marla Hendricks, the board chair, appeared at the end of the cul-de-sac, her posture rigid, the clipboard queen's signature expression of authority firmly in place. The enforcer in crimson scanned each property meticulously, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, a sound that had become synonymous with impending reprimand. The tyrant in heels had issued yet another round of notices overnight, each filled with vague accusations and overreaching claims designed to intimidate. But this time, the officer of rules was met with something she hadn't expected: calculated defiance, strategically aligned among residents who had been quietly observing her missteps. Inside my home office, I reviewed notes gathered from the conflicted witness, who had already provided crucial insight into Marla Hendricks's pattern of selective enforcement. The clipboard queen had consistently applied rules unevenly, manipulating homeowners into compliance while bypassing proper procedures. With each revelation, it became clear that the enforcer in crimson had been relying on ignorance and fear rather than lawful authority. The tyrant in heels overconfidence was her vulnerability, and we intended to exploit it with precision. I traced each bylaw, each improperly issued fine, building a mental map of weaknesses to leverage. By mid-morning, neighbors began arriving at my home under the guise of routine visits, but each brought stories, details, and confirmations of Marla Hendricks's inconsistencies. The board chair, expecting silent acquiescence, was confronted instead with a network of citizens quietly united in purpose. The officer of rules paused at the gate, noting subtle shifts in the demeanor of each resident. Where she anticipated hesitation, she instead encountered calculated calm. The enforcer in crimson's authority, once absolute, was subtly eroding with every witness statement and every corroborated account shared among the homeowners. I convened a discreet meeting in the backyard, a symbolic neutral ground where the conflicted witness provided the final pieces of actionable intelligence. They recounted specific instances where fines had been issued without quorum approval, and how the clipboard queen had unilaterally altered bylaws for personal gain. Each detail was methodically logged, forming the backbone of a strategy that would soon place Marla Hendricks in a position she could not control. The tyrant in heels, accustomed to dictating every aspect of neighborhood order, had inadvertently supplied the tools for her own exposure. As the day progressed, the board chair began to make rounds, attempting to reassert dominance. Her posture remained stern, the officer of rules still in command, but there was an undercurrent of caution. She glanced at the neighbors who were now quietly coordinated, signaling through subtle cues and nods. The enforcer in crimson underestimated the silent preparation that had been underway since yesterday. Each observation, each shared piece of evidence from the conflicted witness had contributed to a growing, organized resistance that Marla Hendricks had failed to anticipate. I spent the afternoon confirming the logistics for the upcoming community event, ensuring every detail highlighted Marla Hendricks's procedural violations while maintaining legal and social propriety. The tyrant in heel's next move would be critical. We had positioned ourselves so that any attempt to enforce her whims would be exposed publicly. The officer of rules, usually confident in manipulation, now faced a web of transparency, strategic planning, and collective awareness. This shift in momentum was subtle, but undeniable. The board chair, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, each had underestimated the cohesion and intelligence of the neighbors rallying quietly behind the scenes. By evening, the stage was set. Marla Hendricks would arrive at the next scheduled gathering, expecting submission, but instead, she would confront a united front, armed with documented evidence and a meticulously prepared strategy. Every action taken by the tyrant in heels up to this point had contributed to the inevitability of her exposure. The officer of rules' confidence, built on fear and unchecked authority, would falter under scrutiny. The careful orchestration of each element, from the conflicted witness's intelligence to the resident's strategic alignment, promised a confrontation that would decisively shift control away from the clipboard queen and restore balance to Willow Creek. The morning air in Willow Creek carried an unusual tension, a quiet storm waiting to break. Marla Hendricks, the board chair, appeared at her usual vantage point, clipboard in hand, scanning the neighborhood like a general assessing a battlefield. The enforcer in crimson's heels clicked sharply against the pavement, the sound almost defiant against the silence that hung over the houses. The clipboard queen's signature glare swept over each property, expecting submission, obedience, and fear. But instead, she found eyes that no longer flinched. The tyrant in heels had miscalculated the growing strength of unity among the residents, and the officer of rules was about to encounter the consequences of underestimating collective resolve. Inside my home, I reviewed the plans for the upcoming community meeting, ensuring that every procedural misstep Marla Hendricks had taken was documented and ready to be presented. The board chair's overreach had been meticulously recorded, fines issued without quorum, unauthorized bylaw modifications, favoritism in contractor selection. Each infraction was cross-referenced with dates, signatures, and witness accounts. The enforcer in crimson had given us the evidence we needed, her rigidity and insistence on control becoming the foundation of our case. The clipboard queen had essentially handed us the keys to unravel her authority, one violated bylaw at a time. By mid-morning, neighbors began to gather discreetly, passing notes and sharing subtle nods of confirmation. The tyrant in heels, confident in her habitual control, didn't notice the quiet coordination. The officer of rules assumed her presence alone was enough to command attention. But the tide had shifted. Each homeowner carried a piece of the puzzle, a recollection or proof that contributed to the larger strategy. Marla Hendricks, the board chair, remained oblivious to the invisible web forming around her authority, the enforcer in crimson failing to see the calculated patience in our movements. I convened the conflicted witness for a final review, ensuring the sequence of violations and procedural breaches was airtight. They recounted interactions with the clipboard queen, emphasizing moments when fines were applied inconsistently or contractors were chosen for personal gain rather than community benefit. Each testimony added weight, each observation a nail in the coffin of Marla Hendricks's unquestioned rule. The tyrant in heels, blinded by her assumed supremacy, had inadvertently built a record that would expose her manipulation and arbitrariness. The officer of rules had provided us with every tool necessary to challenge her dominion, legally and publicly. By early afternoon, preparations for the Liberty gathering were complete, Tables were set, informational boards ready, and a clear agenda outlined, all designed to highlight Marla Hendrix's mismanagement without breaching decorum. The board chair's schedule indicated she would arrive expecting routine compliance and fearful acknowledgement, but the neighborhood had other plans. Each resident's presence, carefully timed and positioned, was intended to show solidarity, while the structured presentation of evidence would reveal the clipboard queen's inconsistencies. The enforcer in crimson had created a scenario where any attempt to assert unilateral power would be immediately scrutinized. The tension escalated as Marla Hendrix's limousine approached, the officer of rules stepping down to meet the gathering with a confident, albeit cautious, stride. The tyrant in heels anticipated routine deference, but the eyes meeting hers told a different story. Every glance was measured, deliberate, filled with subtle defiance and expectation. The board chair was about to encounter a community no longer cowed, no longer silent. Our strategy, built on patience, observation, and collective courage, was ready to transform the neighborhood's dynamic completely. As the crowd settled, the air thick with anticipation, I took a moment to breathe, steadying myself for the presentation. The clipboard queen, the enforcer in crimson, the tyrant in heels, they had all underestimated the meticulous preparation, the strategic alignment, and the quiet but unwavering resolve of the homeowners. Marla Hendrix would soon learn that authority rooted in intimidation and arbitrary enforcement was vulnerable to transparency, evidence, and community solidarity. The stage was set for a confrontation that would finally challenge the board chair's control and restore balance to Willow Creek. The community hall smelled of polished wood and anticipation, the air vibrating with restrained energy. Marla Hendrix, the board chair, had arrived early, clipboard clutched like a shield, heels clicking against the polished floor. The enforcer in crimson moved beside her, eyes scanning the room, calculating, anticipating, assuming control. The clipboard queen's posture was rigid, a symbol of authority honed over years of habitual command. The tyrant in heels expected deference, but as the homeowners filled the seats, murmurs of quiet resistance replaced the usual obedient whispers. Even the officer of rules, trained in oversight, seemed unsure, sensing the shift in balance. I entered the hall deliberately late, observing every subtle reaction. Eyes followed my movement, measuring intent, questioning the confidence I carried. The board chair shifted uneasily as I approached the podium, adjusting the paperwork she had intended to use as intimidation. The enforcer in crimson's smirk faltered, and the clipboard queen's grip on authority seemed to slacken. The tyrant in heels, normally unshakable, shifted her stance. The officer of rules glanced around, realizing the room was no longer under unilateral control. I began the presentation calmly, methodically. Marla Hendrix's violation notices were displayed first, each one punctuated by the procedural errors that undermined their legitimacy. The board chair had meticulously documented arbitrary fines, selective enforcement, and unauthorized bylaw edits. The enforcer in crimson had inadvertently built a timeline of missteps. The clipboard queen's own records now revealed inconsistencies that even she could not refute. Every homeowner's testimony added weight, illustrating the repeated abuse of power and highlighting the officer of rules' failure to correct deviations. The tyrant in heels was confronted with evidence too precise to ignore. I moved through the presentation, letting facts speak louder than accusations. Marla Hendrix, the board chair, tried to interject, but each point was anticipated, countered with procedural references and dates. The enforcer in crimson looked to her for cues, but the structure of the presentation left little room for improvisation. The clipboard queen's usual authority was neutralized by the transparency of evidence. The tyrant in heels' confidence waned as neighbors nodded, murmured agreement, spreading like wildfire. The officer of rules could no longer maintain the illusion of control. Then came the strategic reveal. The petition for recall, signed by more than 35% of homeowners, far surpassing the required threshold. Each signature was a statement, a refusal to tolerate arbitrary power. The board chair, Marla Hendrix, turned pale, realizing the weight of collective action. The enforcer in crimson's posture stiffened in disbelief. The clipboard queen's eyes darted nervously, and the tyrant in heels' mask of authority cracked. The officer of rules looked on, acknowledging the undeniable power of preparation, unity, and strategy. Questions from the audience flowed, but the groundwork was thorough. Each query about fines, bylaw edits, and favoritism was answered with evidence and calm authority. Marla Hendricks attempted to assert control, but the room's allegiance had shifted. The enforcer in Crimson's attempts to intervene were met with collective dissent. The clipboard queen's directives were ignored, and the tyrant in heel's usual intimidation failed. The officer of rules, now a silent observer, understood the balance of power had irrevocably changed. By the meeting's conclusion, the vote for recall was counted. Marla Hendricks, the board chair, faced the reality of her removal from office. The enforcer in Crimson, the clipboard queen, and the tyrant in heels were left to process the loss of unquestioned authority. The officer of rules had witnessed the triumph of transparency, preparation, and community resolve. Homeowners celebrated quietly, their unity and patience vindicated. Marla Hendricks's reign of arbitrary power ended not with confrontation, but with methodical, undeniable proof. The aftermath of the recall vote hung in the air like the scent of freshly cut grass, clean, sharp, and full of possibility. Marla Hendricks, the board chair, had been dethroned, her clipboard now empty, her power stripped away by the very rules she had tried to bend. The enforcer in Crimson lingered at the edges of the hall, hesitant, watching neighbors exchange quiet congratulations. The clipboard queen muttered under her breath, realizing the meticulous plans she had relied on for dominance had crumbled. The tyrant in heels, usually untouchable in her swagger, seemed smaller, her presence diminished in the charged calm. Even the officer of rules, who had silently enforced minor tyrannies, nodded to the fairness of the procedure, acknowledging that transparency had won over arbitrary authority. I walked through the hall slowly, observing the faces of neighbors, relief, pride, and empowerment painted on every countenance. The water line that Marla Hendricks had cut now symbolized more than just a utility issue. It had become a representation of accountability, of the power of preparation and unity. Each homeowner who had signed the petition understood the stakes they had preserved, their community, their rights, their voice. The board chair's attempts at intimidation, the enforcer in Crimson's polished menace, the clipboard queen's meticulous schemes, the tyrant in heel's threats, all were neutralized by law, evidence, and collective action. I took a moment to address the room, not as a commander or adversary, but as a fellow resident. "This neighborhood belongs to all of us," I said, voice calm but resonant. "The rules exist to serve us, not to dominate us. And today, we prove that when we act together, with clarity and patience, fairness prevails." The enforcer in Crimson looked away, unable to counter the sentiment. The clipboard queen's eyes softened slightly, perhaps recognizing the wisdom in transparency. The tyrant in heels crossed her arms, defensive but subdued. The officer of rules remained stoic, quietly approving the restoration of justice. Marla Hendricks, finally, had no argument left. Her era of unilateral control was officially over. Neighbors began to disperse, the energy shifting from tension to quiet celebration. Conversations buzzed about plans for improvements, communal activities, and ways to prevent future abuses of power. The water line, once a point of conflict, was now a symbol of resilience and vigilance. Marla Hendricks's attempt to manipulate the system had inadvertently united the community, teaching everyone the value of knowledge, preparedness, and unity. The board chair's clipboard remained untouched, the enforcer in Crimson's posture slackened, the clipboard queen's strategies defeated, the tyrant in heels humbled, and the officer of rules reminded that rules exist to protect, not oppress. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm amber light across the streets, I reflected on the journey. Every subtle maneuver, every observation, and every neighbor's contribution had mattered. Marla Hendricks's power had been dismantled, not through conflict or rage, but through strategic compliance, community mobilization, and a meticulous understanding of the rules. The neighborhood was no longer fractured. It had found cohesion in the most unlikely of catalysts, an abused water line, and a misused bylaw. Finally, standing at the center of the street, I let the silence settle, a quiet triumph that resonated deeper than any loud confrontation could. The residents had learned a vital lesson. Vigilance, unity, and strategy could protect their homes from arbitrary authority. Marla Hendricks, the board chair, had been defeated, her authority nullified. The enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, and even the officer of rules now had to respect the collective power of an informed, united community. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Let this story remind everyone watching that knowledge, preparation, and unity can overcome even the most relentless enforcement of arbitrary power.